Pediatrics at Brown University in Rhode Island. He's also the Associate Director of NICU and the Director of Respiratory Care Services at Women and Infants Hospital in Rhode Island as well. His focus is on advanced modes of conventional and high-frequency ventilation, the prevention of lung injury, and pulmonary hypertension. He's also one of the trial officers for the SAIL trial, something that we're doing here at the Royal Alex Hospital. We'd like to welcome Dr. Keslzer. His talk is going to be on something very, very interesting and a hot topic for us, definitely. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you, Derek, for the opportunity to come to your meeting, which is rapidly displacing Snowbird, as far as I can see, and so that's great, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I will talk about a few things that are relevant. I will first try to impress on you how much damage we can actually do with high-frequency ventilation, as well as conventional for that matter. Talking about CO2 values out of range, which so often happen. Review some of the scary things that we've done in the past with high-frequency trials. And then talk about, so hopefully having convinced you that it would be nice to avoid those kinds of problems, we'll talk about how HFOV with volume guarantee works, and talk about what tidal volume to expect to be able to use. So I have been a consultant over many years for Draeger and have received some honoraria for lectures. I will try to be very objective, as I typically am. So we know in conventional ventilation, we have used volume-targeted ventilation for many years because of the things listed on the slide. The fact that the evidence is quite convincing that we should be talking about volume trauma, not barotrauma, because volume, not pressure, is the primary determinant of lung injury. And we all know, I'm sure you have seen it in your own practice, that hyperventilation is quite common, regardless of what mode of ventilation you use, as long as it's pressure-controlled ventilation. And you all know that hypocapnia is bad for the brain, it's bad for the lungs, it should be avoided. And specifically as it relates to high-frequency ventilation, as you already heard, CO2 elimination is proportional to tidal volume squared, approximately squared. So it's even more important, perhaps, to try to regulate the tidal volume with high frequency. And so here's some old data that are a little scary. Comes back, last century, but this is what used to happen. And you can see, and somehow the formatting really does go funny here because the labels are off the screen. But what this shows is that all sorts of bad things, such as severe interventricular hemorrhage on the left, periventricular leukomalacia, and cerebral palsy are all more common. See here, I think this is PVL, severe hemorrhage, and cerebral palsy are all more common the lower the lowest CO2 was in this study using conventional ventilation. Bad stuff. So we really don't want to do that. There are some interesting data from a retrospective observational study indicating that both low and high CO2 values are problematic. And so this is just looked at severe interventricular hemorrhage. And just being mechanically ventilated by itself seemed to increase the odds of that. My personal conviction is that it has to do more with the intubation and giving surfactant than actual ventilation in absolute terms, but be that as it may. But we certainly see that very high CO2s early in the first 3 days of life can increase the risk of interventricular hemorrhage. There's other studies showing the same thing, but also somewhat low CO2. And we always knew very low CO2 was bad, but it turns out that even modestly low CO2 might be associated with significant increases. And finally, so we should really be rather careful. See the mouse does funny things here. So here is a meta-analysis. There's several out there, and this is the most recent one, comparing pressure-limited ventilation to volume-targeted ventilation. And there are different kinds of volume-targeted ventilation. And this is all conventional, but it shows some fairly striking advantages to volume-targeted ventilation. Mortality is the only one that was not significantly different, but it was certainly trending in the right direction. Maybe it's easier to point with the mouse here if it works. There we go, sort of. So mortality suggested a 73% reduction. Not sure what I'm doing here. Well, let's get rid of this mouse. It's driving me crazy. Let's try to do it this way. And so there was a strong trend, but didn't quite reach statistical significance. So this shows the number of studies, so a total of 11 studies, that not all of them looked at all of these outcomes. And this is the number of subjects that were analyzed in the meta-analysis. Looking at any intraventricular hemorrhage, there was about 35% reduction with this range. This is the confidence interval, 95% confidence interval. So it could have been more than 50% or close to no difference. More severe intraventricular hemorrhage, there's a roughly 45% reduction. That's the point estimate, is this confidence interval. Chronic lung disease, looked at in 9 studies, reduced by about 40%. Cystic PVL, the really bad brain injury, most consistently associated with bad outcome, looked at in 7 studies, and there was a quite dramatic reduction of about 2/3 reduction in that incident. So pretty dramatic, and this is the one you would expect, right? We know hyperventilation is most closely associated with cystic PVL. Pneumothorax was reduced by more than 50% duration of oxygen. So pretty strong evidence in terms of conventional ventilation that volume-targeted ventilation compared to pressure-limited ventilation has some advantages. Clearly, we don't, well, this is really weird. That's not what this slide looks like on my computer, so I apologize. So this is, let's talk about some high-frequency ventilation trial data. And this is actually originally the old HFOV study, which we don't know what the explanation was for all these bad outcomes, but you can see lots of things went bad. Air leak syndrome, need for pressors, severe intraventricular hemorrhage, PVL, failure of assign mode. All the discussions after this was published focused on not using the right strategy, not doing lung volume recruitment. I hypothesize that actually this may have been related to air trapping or hyperventilation, or both, because all of these complications you might see if you were air trapping. They use the hummingbird oscillator with a 1-to-1 ratio, which we know under some circumstances can air trap, which might give you all of this. Or perhaps they weren't paying attention to CO2. We know how easy it is to overventilate with high frequency. And again, you might see, if you're overventilating, you certainly might see these sorts of things. So we don't know, but this is just one of many trials of high frequency that show that, you know, it's a wonderful tool. I love high frequency ventilation, obviously, but it can also be a dangerous tool when not used optimally. Other studies, things that weren't necessarily emphasized, the HFOV trial, which was rescue use of high frequency, among other things, looked at intraventricular hemorrhage. I mean, you know, the HFOV worked, high frequency worked in that study, and there were some improved outcomes. But oh, by the way, kind of buried in the report was that, you know, there was a little bit more intraventricular hemorrhage in the high frequency group. Most of it was not severe IVH, but even here, so the scale is compressed. But if you look at it, there was a difference that was statistically significant. And why might that have been? Well, you know, it turns out that the CO2 was a little lower. Is that lower enough? We don't know. But you look at the standard deviation. So the mean wasn't that different, but standard deviations were pretty large. So some babies were hyperventilated. Maybe that's the ones that had to bleed. And here is the difference. So this is from the French multicenter trial. It was the old Dufour oscillator, which is no longer in production, because after they published this, they were like, oh, no, I don't think so. We probably don't want to use that one. And it wasn't, I don't think, the ventilator itself, but here you go. higher incidence of severe intraventricular hemorrhage, and they didn't really demonstrate any advantage in terms of chronic lung disease. And again, CO2 was lower in the high-frequency group. Not intentionally, it just fell that way. And then, of course, there was, and again, these slides somehow don't come out right in this formatting, but, and oddly enough, I have a Mac too. I just put it on my Mac and look fine. So, go figure. Modern technology. So this is the old trial that Tom Wiswell ended up being the first author for, even though I think he kind of came into the middle of it, so I can't entirely blame it on my friend Tom. But this was a study that compared high-frequency jet ventilation and conventional ventilation, but they used a strategy that employed low mean airway pressures. And it was a vestige of the way we used to use the jet when we used to use it only for PIE. And it was probably a reasonable strategy for PIE, and I'll show some of that later. But used in this context, it was bad. If you look at, so you can't read this, but I'll tell you, this is grade 3-4 IVH, significantly higher with the jet, or not significantly, I'm sorry, but certainly trending strong. The cystic PVL, very dramatic and significant difference, and overall bad outcome, death, PVL, severe IVH. Why was this? Well, it turned out upon careful inspection that this really all had to do with pH and PCO2. So when they looked at the pHs, they were higher in the jet group. And this wasn't statistically significant on day one, but it was statistically significant here, and it was in aggregate. And what you unfortunately don't see here is the scale, but this is pH. We're looking at pH of about 7.6 here, which is, none of us would intentionally do today, hopefully. But it can happen unintentionally. And again, God knows why my axes have disappeared, but I tell you what it shows. This looks at CO2. And although it doesn't look dramatically different, what's circled here is that this is about 15 this is 15, this is 20, this is 25. So these babies were hyperventilated to a pretty dramatic degree, and not intentionally. They weren't trying to do this, but this is what happened. And so it's probably not a good thing. And not only so there was not as you noticed, not a dramatic difference here in terms of the maximally. So this is the single point, right? The lowest CO2. Now that's not that dramatically different. But it's not just how low does it get, it's how long it stays there. So duration of low CO2, duration of hyperventilation is important, and this is what's shown here. This is duration of hypocapnia was much greater in those babies that developed the PDL. Again, not a good thing. So, not trying to scare you, and this is consistent, by the way, with all the data with conventional ventilation that showed that an association between duration of hypocapnia and bad outcomes like cystic PVL. So the data are entirely consistent. It doesn't matter which mode of ventilation you're using. The bad outcomes are not attributable to the device, they're attributable to the way it's used. But as we know, all high-frequency devices have been used certainly historically as pressure control ventilators. And therefore, when compliance changes, guess what? Volume goes up, CO2 goes down, and bad things can happen to the brain. And so we're going to try to avoid that, clearly. So we did a study at the same time as Tom's group in Philadelphia. Ours was a multicenter trial. And we, by then, had recognized that the low-pressure strategy wasn't the right strategy when now treating babies with RDS. This was first-line treatment for babies with uncomplicated RDS. And it turned out, when Tom presented his data, we were like, oh my goodness, this is not good. Let's pause our trial and let's see what we've got. We're about 2/3 of the way through our projected numbers. But it turned out we stopped the trial at that point. And what we saw, though, was looking, and I won't tell you, it actually did show, I will tell you, it did show benefit of jet ventilation in terms of reducing chronic lung disease. And it showed no overall increase in severe brain injury. In fact, there was a trend toward less with jet compared to conventional. But it turned out that not everybody was following the strategy that we prescribed, that is the optimal volume strategy, that some clinicians, and again in those days we were doing trials on the shoestring, so there was not as close oversight as to whether everybody's doing exactly what they're supposed to do. So it turned out that about a quarter of the babies were being ventilated the same way as in Philadelphia, that is with the low pressure strategy. And when we compared the two, clearly the low pressure strategy babies had more brain injury than those that were ventilated as prescribed. And again, it turns out to be related to CO2. This was conventional, this was the optimal volume strategy. In those days, we were a little bit more, we're looking at the 90s, today we would be higher. We started around 40, and all groups dropped a little, but these kids clearly dropped more. Look at the standard deviation here. So clearly there were babies with CO2s in the 20s. And again, this is not a good thing. So I'm hoping I convinced you that hyperventilation is bad and it can easily happen with high frequency ventilation. So why does hyperventilation happen? This is old data from many, many years ago, but it's still true today. There is this inverse relationship, right, at a maximum amplitude. As you go down in frequency, the tidal volume goes up to very high levels in this case, because it was at maximum output with the sensormetics. And so in the usual operating range of maybe 5 to 15, it's a rather steep curve. Turns out, as you saw, this is the reason for it, so I won't belabor it, but by having slower frequency, there is more time for gas, there's more net volume that's displaced for any given amplitude at the lower frequency. At higher frequencies, so tidal volume goes up. When tidal volume goes up, CO2 goes down, of course. And the effect of tidal volume, of course, overrides the effect of frequency because it's tidal volume squared, and therefore everybody knows this relationship. When you go down on your frequency on the oscillator, CO2 will drop, opposite of what you normally see with conventional ventilation. You don't see this phenomenon with the jet, because with the jet the I time stays the same. And just to show you that this is still true today, this is from the same paper that David just showed. All devices are frequency dependent. There's really not that big of a difference. This is with 1:1, 1:2 ratios. There wasn't that much of a difference. So as you go down in frequency, your tidal volume drops, but it's still 5. I mean, how big of a tidal volume do you need with high frequency? Really not that much. But as he pointed out, the optimum operating range of the EM500 is a little bit lower than with the other devices. So again, you saw this already, but the practical implication of this relationship, again, is even a modest change in tidal volume can result in large changes in CO2. So again, the danger of hyperventilation is greater with high frequency because of this geometric relationship of CO2 elimination to tidal volume. And of course, again, you need to also appreciate that relationship between frequency and tidal volume. So if I hopefully succeeded in convincing you that controlling tidal volume during high frequency ventilation might be a good idea, then let's talk about how it works, or whether in fact it does work. It's really the same concept. as conventional volume guarantee. And this conventional volume guarantee, you set a pressure limit and you set a target tidal volume, and the machine can regulate the inflation pressure up or down to maintain that set tidal volume up to that pressure limit. It's the same concept, but of course the difference is here what you're setting is the amplitude limit. Same concept, however, and the machine will regulate the amplitude, actual amplitude that's being used, in order to target that tidal volume that you, the clinician, selected for this particular patient at this particular time. And of course, that's the tricky part. And I'll show you some data, at least in terms of what the usual things are and what affect those. The difference between, additional difference is that it's not breath to breath, quote unquote, or cycle to cycle, because of the high frequency, but it's averaging over 2 or 3 seconds. Other than that, pretty much the same concept. But now you're going to have to get used to the fact that once you keep your tidal volume fixed on the oscillator, if you now make a change in frequency, you're not going to get that same response as you did before. You fix the tidal volume, so you're going to get the same sort of response as you would with conventional ventilation. You go down on rate, CO2 will go up, not down. So for teaching the young ones, the uninitiated ones are going to be confused initially if you start using volume guarantee on high frequency and they're used to it behaving differently. So just a caveat there to keep in mind. So there are limited data, limited published data on the oscillator in the volume guarantee mode. And what we have is a nice paper published a couple of years ago that looked at what happened with volume guarantee on, volume guarantee off, so very much along the lines of what I just told you is true. So I like to support my assertions with at least some data. And so with volume guarantee off, standard use of high frequency oscillatory ventilation, again, you have cranked up the amplitude to maximum, so you're getting some mighty big tidal volumes here. And as you go up on the frequency, the tidal volume goes down. When you turn on your VG, and you say you set it here at whatever, I think it looks like 14 or 15, you are going to maintain that pretty stable until you start to get into the limitations. And the limit on the VN500 is simply related to the way that the device works. So basically, it's not a piston oscillator. It doesn't have a big loudspeaker like the Sensomatics. The way it generates positive deflection is it squirts as much gas as needed down the inspiratory limb, so opens all or some of the solenoids. And there's a maximum of about, I think, 120 liters that you can shoot down there. And then the expiratory, the negative deflection, which is equal in magnitude to the positive pressure. It is a true oscillator by any measure, because as David explained, it's the waveform that matters. That's generated by a powerful venturi on the expiratory limb. But the limitation here is related to the maximum flow that is available when you open up the solenoids, and obviously the inspiratory time. So if your inspiratory time, the period of time when the solenoids are open, obviously gets shorter as you increase your frequency at any given IE ratio. And so for that reason, because there's less limitation on the output at 1-to-1 ratio, Drager has been telling people to use 1-to-1 ratio. I say don't use 1-to-1 ratio. I use 1-to-2, because if you look at the literature, the only studies that demonstrated benefit of oscillatory ventilation, there were 2 key characteristics. I don't know if both are key. Certainly, optimal and volume strategy is key. But the other consistent characteristic is 1-to-2 IE ratio. Several studies that used it 1-to-1 IE ratio. The Dufour, the French study, the Hi-Fi trial did not show benefit, in fact showed some harm. So, and the reason why it makes sense is, of course, if you have a longer period for expiration, exhalation, whatever the right term is, Colin, for high frequency, I'm not sure. You need less negative pressure deflection, less likelihood of collapsing the airway. When you suck real hard, you're more likely to collapse airway and trap. So I strongly prefer a 1-to-2 ratio, and at 1-to-2 ratio, you do begin to see limitations when you get to really high frequencies. But it works as advertised, and I've done similar things without, not quite so formally, and since it had already been done, I didn't publish it, but you can replicate this in your own lab. This is what happens. Furthermore, then looking at DCO2, which, as you know, is that calculated value, that frequency times tidal volume squared. It does what you would expect it to do. Again, here with VG off, you get the expected, as your frequency goes down, goes up, your tidal volume goes down, and therefore DCO2 goes down. With VG on, you go up on frequency, the DCO2 goes up, and therefore CO2 will go down, just like with conventional ventilation. So it does what it's supposed to, but again, it reaches a limit, and then you begin to come off. And it's, again, it depends on the size of your baby. But these were pretty big tidal ones. Remember, these tidal ones were like 12, what they had locked in here. Let's see if this goes back. No, for some reason I don't want to go. That's okay. So what is the optimal frequency, though? We could argue about. There is the pressure cost of ventilation issue. So people have argued, and this is a recent paper that made that argument that obviously the higher the frequency, the smaller tidal volume you need to maintain a stable CO2. And of course that's true. But we don't know, whether there is a direct correlation with lung injury, or whether that, from the Venegas data, it suggests that it wasn't a linear relationship, but rather it went up once you got to really relatively low frequencies. So in any case, it is what it is. This is what we know. Lots we don't know. All right, well, what's the right tidal volume? I mean, it's all fine and good if you can regulate tidal volume, but what tidal volume should we be aiming for? And, most of us, we're starting there. I don't know. See what we can see. So look back at the literature. People had measured tidal volumes with the Florian upwire anemometer on several occasions previously with the Sensormedics device. And these were the approximate data that they came up with. This is just clinical observational data. These were babies of this gestation age, so relatively large preemies on various different amplitudes, quite wide range, mind you, of both in every parameter. So this is a mishmash, right? This is not very helpful because they threw together a whole bunch of babies with different disease processes, with different sizes, different postnatal ages, and came up with a mean. But look at the ranges, right? These are the interquartile ranges. They're huge. It doesn't help us very much. So, all right, that's what's out there. Small numbers anyway, but very large ranges. Another study, more recent, same sort of problem. Mean was 2.5, plus or minus a fairly large amount. And this was something about sectioning that really didn't make any difference. But the point is, one size clearly does not fit all, and we know this to be true with conventional ventilation. There's absolutely no reason to expect that that would not also be true with high-frequency ventilation. So there are some data. Since we didn't have access to high-frequency oscillation on this DN500 in the US at the time, I asked some colleagues, this one from Japan, to collect some data on tidal volumes and CO2s, and well, this is what we got. What we got was Not a very strong relationship between tidal volume and CO2 for the very same reason. Different babies, different sizes, both natal ages. So it's really not that useful, right? Because there was rather a wide range. So can we make more sense of it? Well, let's look at the relationship between babies' birth weight and tidal volume. And there is a pretty nice linear relationship with the tiniest babies needing a larger tidal volume than the bigger babies. Notice these tidal volumes are, you know, a little bit larger than what most people think of in terms of high-frequency ventilation. Every review article, every chapter on high-frequency ventilation starts off with the assertion that high-frequency ventilation uses tidal volumes below dead space. And that's mostly not true. It's true for healthy animals frequency of 15. Once you start developing getting into more complicated things, sicker babies, I'll show you, need bigger tidal volume. Smaller subjects need a bigger tidal volume. And this has to do with the dead space of the flow sensor, as best as we can tell, because we've shown very much the same thing conventionally. So here is looking at it a different way, and this just shows in categories less than 750, 750 to 1,000 and greater than 1,000 grams. The bigger babies, relatively small tidal volume. The smaller babies, you're up there a little bit over 2 ml per kilo. So not huge, but again, there is a significant range. All these numbers, every number that you look at it for anything, these are means, right? And there's a range. There's always a range. So these are all interesting starting points. But your particular baby in front of you may need more, or may need less. And how much they need changes over time. So this is just ballpark. This is something that may be useful so that you have a reasonable expectation, but babies are different. Every baby is different. Averages don't apply. But just to show you that we saw the exact same thing when we looked at tidal volume with conventional ventilation. And again, looked at babies less than 800 grams. Again, there's something funny about the formatting, but the tidal volume for the extremely low birth weight infants of around 800 grams, or this is weird, why is it doing that? Because those are not the numbers that were there. All right. Needed tidal volume of about 5 per kilo. In the ridiculously low birth weight infants, that's my new acronym. Around 400 or 500 grams. You know, I have several copyrighted terms. Epophobia is one. Now I have a new one, which is barophobia, because it's volume phobia that we should all have, not barophobia, and the ridiculously low birth weight infant. So they need more, and again, it's a dead space. So the dead space of the flow sensor for the BN500 and the big log is about 0.7 ml. And that stays the same with the baby's 500 grams or a kilo. So it becomes proportionately more important, and you have to compensate for that. But it's not doubling it. In fact, what we found is that actually half the babies were ventilating a tidal volume that was no larger than dead space. And for, where is David? I don't see him here. I have to tell him that there is a price you pay when you use a lower rise time or lower flow rate, because it doesn't work quite as well. Anyway, let's move on. So what about severity of illness? Turns out, similar to conventional, the sicker babies need bigger tidal volume. Obviously, there were more babies that were not so sick. These are data from Poland now, from Jan Mazala's place. And again, the sicker the babies, the higher the tidal volume per kilo needed to be. And there's very much parallels older data from Prague, where Richard Pufka's fellow or colleague, I forget which, again documented the same thing. Here looking at AADO2, so the same thing. The sicker they were, the larger the tidal volume per kilo needed to be. But again, there is a scatter, there's a range. But there's a striking parallel. So the same factors that influence tidal volume with conventional ventilation, tidal volume requirement, also apply with high frequency. So here we are with a summary data from Poland where they looked and after multivariate analysis, they determined again, so here they analyzed it by gestational age, but that's obviously proxy for size. And the difference is not huge, but they're significant. Older babies need tidal volume that's larger. Sicker babies need a larger tidal volume, and that's quite a substantial difference. And not surprisingly, obviously, there was a relationship between frequency and tidal volume needed for normal apnea. So here, in smaller babies, you can see they were able to use frequencies, the more traditional frequencies, if you will, of 13 and 15. But even with the sensormedics, many of us have moved down to 10 or 12, even with small babies, so it's not that much of a departure. And again, I want to remind you that the older baby needing larger tidal volumes has been shown before for conventional ventilation. Here, babies, the same cohort of babies that we looked at before, less than 800 grams, starting tidal volume need of about 5 ml. And the PCO2 starting up in the mid-40s, and then despite permissive hypercapnia, they're needing a larger tidal volume. So same factors apply, conventional or not. So we in the US have the Food and Drug Administration to thank for keeping useful devices out of our hands. And the BM500 with high frequency mode is one of those devices. So we're at present actually doing a trial to be able to go from only using it as a conventional ventilator to actually be able to use the high frequency feature. There is a group of usual suspects that have been involved with high frequency ventilation over many years, and we are formatting is weird. We are underway. And so we had some dilemmas similar. Somebody asked a question at the break, well, how do you start? How do you pick a tidal volume? And, we don't really know. I made the point that every baby's different. So we could pick a tidal volume. You can do that as conventional volume guarantee based on all the factors I just showed you, and that may be a reasonable starting point. Or you can do it the way we do it with the sensormedics, which we are more comfortable with, and might be a better way to figure out what this particular baby needs to have a good chest wiggle, transcutaneous CO2 in a good place, very far with the blood gas, and then lock back in, and then make it remain stable thereafter. And so we picked option number one, which is start with a best guess at the amplitude, assess chest wall movement, etc. And that's what we are doing. I'm not going to go over all the details of what we're doing, but we're using a frequency of 10 hertz to stay away from any limitations, I ratio 1 to 2, and just basically doing it that way. Our guideline is this is the typical range, so we're starting early. This is first few days of life, so the older baby doesn't come into play here. And it's going okay. It's actually surprising. I know probably some of you have a lot more experience with the volume guarantee. I've only had it on about 7 or 8 babies. But it does seem to work just as it's supposed to, and certainly it does that in the lab, and it was refreshing to see it do that in the baby. So of course we started the easy way, right? This is our first patient we picked. Why not? And this is a couple hours after going on, so we have now locked in a tidal volume of 1.2 for this little over 500 grams. So it's about 2.3 maybe per kilo tidal volume. DCO2, not a lot because it's a tiny baby. Airway pressure fairly high at this point. We got fairly recruited. We're good. Everything went well, and after a few days, even though we knew that both our blood gases and our knowledge of what to expect told us that we probably need to go up a little bit on the tidal volume, so we went up to 1.4. Sorry, that's what we said. So we went up from 1.2 to 1.4, And when all else fails, examine the patient and your waveforms. So we saw the baby was breathing kind of hard. You want the baby to breathe, by the way, on the oscillator, right? Because if they're not breathing and you didn't knock him off, you worry that CO2 is too low or pH is too high, and you've taken away the respiratory drive. So you want them to breathe. I want to make that clear. You want them to breathe a little, but you don't probably want them to breathe, with a lot of retractions and kidney and struggling. And this baby is pulling a bigger tidal balloon than what we said, just like in conventional EG, and breathing rather vigorously over this. So he's telling us, whatever you did, it's not enough, I want more. So we gave him more, he settled, and did okay. So pay attention to your patient, pay attention to the waveform. I'm almost finished, folks, don't worry. We're actually on time. Well-kept secret. It's a pH, not CO2, that's the primary determinant of respiratory drive. So everybody focuses on CO2. We made the same mistake early on, so when we did that. But it's really the pH. So now that we're more aggressively feeding small babies, lots of protein in the TPN on day one, those 23 weekers, 24 weekers, their renal threshold for bicarb isn't what it is later on. They all have a base deficit. And it's sometimes 5 or 6 or more. And we focus just on the CO2, we are going to be doing them a disservice. So what happens commonly is, baby CO2 is 35. That's too low. Turn down the tidal volume. That's both as conventional and high frequency. And when you do that, of course, the baby is going to still be responding to their pH. And so you're going to try to drive the CO2 down to correct their pH. The body is really jealous of pH. It really wants that pH to be as normal as it can be. And so what happens, of course, the baby does it for a while, then he tires, the respiratory effort's often intermittent, and you end up with fluctuating CO2. So while we talk about hyperventilation, hypocapnia as being bad, it's really the pH, but mostly we haven't measured pH. Tom Wiswell did, and it was the pH that had the more significant differences. And pH is what, in fact, regulates your cerebral vascular tone. So we should focus on pH, not so much on CO2. So that's one of the lessons I want to share. And anyways, severe hypercapnia is not anyway a very good thing, but I won't go there. So I hope that gave you a little bit of an idea. There's a hell of a lot we don't know. This is what little we do know about the prospects of some pretty significant benefits, I think, with volume-targeted high-frequency ventilation. I certainly hope I showed you how much damage we can do with it and how prone we are to hyperventilation. And this tool certainly is very promising. We don't have the data yet. We're hoping to gather, obviously, a lot more data. So stay tuned. Hopefully there will be more information. So thank you very much for your attention. In case you're wondering, that's my method of raising